Welcome to Season 2 of Fintechs a podcast by the one and only policy shop for Canada's fintech scene. I'm Alex, and I'll be your host. Join me as I talk to the people who are making a big difference in the lives of Canadians. In this episode, we talk to Abraham Tachjian, Canada's former open banking lead. We talk to him about open banking, what he's learned about big banks, having worked at big banks, some of his lesser-known interests, and what Canada needs to succeed on a more macro level. Abraham, thank you so much for joining us today and putting up with what will probably be about an hour of me badgering you.
It's my pleasure. I'm sure time will fly as it does when you're having fun, right?
For sure. So let's get right into it. People say that Canada has no national identity. At least some allege that. If they're wrong and Canada does have a national identity, I would have to say that consulting is a critical part of it. I'm just going to run through the history of open banking really quickly. In 2018, the government committed to reviewing the merits of open banking. In 2019, the government consulted with Canadians about the merits of open banking. Shortly after that, the government and its advisory committee consulted some more with a series of virtual meetings with a large number of banks, fintechs, credit unions, and others. Around that time, it released an interim report with its findings. Then the government released its advisory committee's final report, which came out long after that and which contained dozens of recommendations. One of those was to appoint a lead, which would be you, to work with the industry and deliver the first phase of open banking. This is around when the government committed in a budget to deliver open banking by no later than 2023. It's now 2024 with a commitment and a budget to deliver open banking. This seems something like real progress, but I can't help but wonder. You produced what I heard is an instruction manual for delivering open banking early last year. So why do we still not have open banking live today?
I've also heard it be called an encyclopedia. So either way, I'll take whatever adjective is used to describe my work. Look, Alex, I think, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I'm a huge listener, so it's a privilege and an honor to be here. To your point on respect to the amount of time it's taken, I think there's two elements we have to address here. First of all, with the introduction of our open banking system, it's not going to be something that is net new to all Canadians in the sense that, as you know, Canadians are already sharing their data with many stakeholders. Unfortunately, they're doing through unsafe screen scraping practices. But I mentioned that just to say that there's a degree of muscle memory already in the market, both from institutions that have been working on developing open banking capabilities, as well as consumers that have been leveraging it, but perhaps not the safest way. Now, with respect to the amount of time it's taken for us to go through the consultations, the appointment of my role, and the decisions that will come after it, I think we're all on the same page in the sense that we wish this would have moved faster. It is what it is. I think it's important not to lose sight of the track that we're developing a data ecosystem here. It requires a lot of lift. Oftentimes you have these comparisons with technology companies and how easily it is to switch services. Fair enough. But I think when you're talking about the financial space where your money is being held at an institution and the data that comes with that is as valuable, when you're trying to build a data ecosystem around it to create a group of participants that act on a consumer's request, that have rules in place with respect to what information is being shared, who's on the hook for something going wrong, privacy requirements, security requirements. It's a big design. It's a lot of effort designing a data ecosystem. And I think it's contributed to perhaps some of the delays we've seen.
One of the things I often hear about Canada is that because our financial sector is so concentrated and because there are so few players, it should be easy in theory to get everyone around an idea, to coordinate, to work together, to actually turn that idea into something real. It's often attributed as the reason why Canada made such progress in chip and PIN in the 90s, why we were so quick to launch something like Interac e-transfer, where when places like the US couldn't replicate that and had to rely on Cash App and Zelle and all the things we're seeing today. If that is true about Canada, shouldn't that be a point in favor of quicker delivery of open banking, not slower?
Yeah. Look, again, it goes back to the point that I was raising with respect to developing a data ecosystem. And forcibly, regardless of the number of participants that you will have, there'll be differing views, right, on fundamental elements of open banking. So I don't think it's an output of the number of organizations that you have that are part of this. Rather, it's the issues that you have to address, right? If you look at from a liability perspective, I don't think having less organizations be part of an open banking system is going to make it roll out faster or will be easier to get to a consensus. And plus, I think when we discuss open banking in the context of banks versus fintechs, I think we leave out a major stakeholder in these discussions, and that being credit unions, right? So I think it's not as small as we think. There's many Canadians that bank with credit unions. It's something that was not lost on me during my engagement, and I made sure that we had credit union voices. So in addition to consulting with the industry, that meant banks, fintechs, credit unions, consumer agencies. I also had a mandate of consulting with federal and provincial regulators, and the provincial regulators have their oversight responsibilities with credit unions. So I don't think it's as small as we think it is. I think we have many stakeholders in Canadian open banking, and I think we did a very good job throughout my term making sure that we had all of their input in the design of the system.
I want to ask you questions about what all that was like, but before we get there, why did you get the job as open banking lead?
Well, if I'm being honest, occasionally I had a bit of imposter syndrome. I asked that to myself. I felt like, I've used this joke before, I felt like Steve Harvey was going to come out of nowhere and say, "Oh, Abraham, wrong envelope. You did not win. You're not the open banking lead." And the decision was the government's. I'm glad they chose me. It was genuinely a privilege and an honor to be part of this. But I think part of the work that I had done overseas, particularly in Singapore and in Hong Kong, may have contributed to that, in the sense that in my early days there, when the regulators in those jurisdictions started to get interested on open banking, I had the opportunity to share our thoughts from a banking perspective, right? With respect to concerns that we would have being part of an open banking system where we see the potential. So a lot of those challenges I had already kind of experienced as working for a British bank when I was in Singapore and Hong Kong, working with those regulators. I think my legal background may have also contributed. I started my career as a lawyer before I transitioned to banking and then consulting. And I think that really helped me assess where the potential pitfalls could be from a legal perspective and try to make sure we had the right people in these consultations to address those issues, to have those discussions early on. So I think, based on my experience in other countries, a bit of my legal background, the French I think also helped as well. I'm from Montreal. I think it kind of facilitated part of the French discussions. So I don't know why they specifically chose me. All I will say is I was very grateful to be part of it. It was an honor, and I was happy to stick around doing the work that we had started with the second round of the consultation.
You helped found a bank in Hong Kong. Tell us a bit about that experience.
Oh boy, yeah. This was mid 2018. It's one of the harder things I've done in my careers. In my career, at the time, I recall my wife and I were about to welcome our first daughter, so the stress level was already through the roof. And then in Hong Kong, we were also in a situation where the regulator had publicly come out and said that their intent was to open the market to new participants, virtual banks. That was the term that was being used. And at the time had, through the requirements, not outlawed, but prevented you from actually having physical branches. So the intent of the government was, from one perspective, to make new entrants come into the Hong Kong banking system. The other hand, making these purely virtual. So the intent was there, which was helpful in terms of getting everybody aligned towards this project. it was also interesting because it was from what I recall, a very publicized project in the sense that you would wake up in the morning and you would read about rumors of who was bidding on this banking license, because to a certain degree, geographically, Hong Kong doesn't compare to Canada, but Hong Kong is a relatively similar banking market in terms of the number of banks that serve the market, in the sense that also people are relatively well banked there, right? What we saw is multiple bank accounts with that consumers held. So there was a degree of, how do I say this, publicity around this, a lot of rumors. It was always in the press. But then there was this compressed timeline, in the sense that the regulator had stated that your applications have to be in by this time. So let me tell you, that was quite the stressful process, drafting a licensing application for a virtual bank from the ground up in a very short amount of time. But thankfully, we did it. I think it took us about 3-4 months, if memory serves. A lot of long hours and weekends, but we got it done. From there, we had a couple of months of engagement with the regulator. And looking back, I think it took us about a year from the announcement to writing the license to having these discussions with the regulator just to get the license. From there, we started building this thing from the ground up. I recall it was myself and a couple of other colleagues of mine that were given this opportunity to go start this. So we rented out this tiny WeWork space, and we were all bankers. We were all working for Standard Chartered. So it's not the work environment we were accustomed to, but we spent a lot of hours hiring people, talking to software vendors for the most elemental things. So it was a genuine fintech startup environment. But at the end of it, I mean, we grew very fast. We brought on a lot of smart people who wanted to have an opportunity to build a new digital bank from the ground up. It's not something that you come across very often. And we went from a handful to almost 200 at the time I left. And to this day, the bank, Mox Bank in Hong Kong, is still growing. It's got a prominent position in the market. And I'm proud of the work that myself and my colleagues did there.
What problem are you trying to solve when you're founding a bank?
Yeah, that's a great one. In fact, it's something we asked ourselves, and we did a lot of market research. I remember we were having interviews with people on the streets. We would go to people's houses and inquire about, some of the challenges they were having with their day-to-day banking. And so that was very, very revealing. I think it's very important, before you actually throw the blood, sweat, tears, and money into projects like this, to do a lot of market research and really, hit the ground running. I recall how my colleagues would go to people's houses and actually have conversations around the number of credit cards they had, and how they would keep an eye on their spending, and what part of their banking services were not addressing their market needs, looking at it from an age demographic perspective. So we did a lot of research to try to identify where the existing incumbents were not serving the market, including us. The digital bank that we started was a subsidiary of our parent, Standard Chartered. So there was a degree of, we're also not, as an organization, addressing these needs. So I would say there's a lot of research that we put into it in the early days to make sure that our product proposition actually captured and addressed market needs. And given how well it's performed to date, I think we've done a pretty good job at that. We did a pretty good job. Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing that really stuck out at me is, the amount of knowledge that was in this organization, right? It's not typically something that you come across as a consumer in terms of getting your services from financial institutions, but there's humans in the background of that. There's people that have spent a lot of time crafting this product that you're being served by, that understand the market, that understand the competitive landscape. So although you may have an opportunity to speak with some of these folks just in your day-to-day business relationships at conferences or whatnot, I think oftentimes we fail to appreciate the amount of effort that goes into actually delivering these products to the market. And then I would say, look, banks are very big organizations. They're often criticized for moving slowly, whether that's right or wrong. It's not up to me to say. But I'll say that there's a lot of moving parts within financial institutions, right? Because essentially they're in the business of managing risk, and people are very, very stringent when it comes to an organization managing their money or holding their money, as they should be. So I think there's a lot of processes in place to make sure that that trust, that custodial relationship that they have with their consumers is maintained. And I think financial institutions have done a very, very good job. So I think some of the things we miss as day-to-day consumers is the amount of effort that goes in within these organizations to make sure that that's still reality.
You said you spent some time in Singapore as well. What did you do there?
Yeah, and Singapore was my the first stop on my career in Asia. So I started back then with the intent of getting some experience in Asia, and this traces back to the time where I was in law school. I had an opportunity to study in Beijing, and afterwards I took a trip down the coast of China. Ended up in Hong Kong, and it just completely blew me away as a younger guy. I said I wanted to have an opportunity to work in Asia, just in terms of business experience. And through, I guess, serendipity or just pure luck, that opportunity presented itself in Singapore. So I moved there genuinely without knowing anyone, without having any clue about what Singapore is like from a business personal perspective. As soon as I got off the plane, I learned very, very fast that it is very hot and humid, but I managed that afterwards. So it was the stepping stone for me to transition from law to the business side. And so that's what I think working at Standard Chartered in Singapore really gave me the opportunity to do, to transition from a purely legal function to understanding banking more from a procedural perspective, from a risk perspective. So it was a great opportunity. And I encourage anyone in their career, if they have the chance to go work in another country, to get a different view of the landscape from a financial perspective, from a business perspective, and personal perspective as well. And this, I wouldn't limit this just to banking professionals, anyone really. Oftentimes I have an opportunity to speak to some junior folks that are starting up in their careers, and oftentimes I'll make that suggestion. Like, look, you want to have a different perspective. You want to bring something to the table that's different from all the other university grads. Try to take a risk, move to another country, try to see how that business functions in that country. And I assure you, you'll come back richer for the experience. So I know I was.
What struck you about Singapore?
First, it's very clean. It was very clean. It was very hot. The local coffee was stronger than I anticipated. Kopi, I would strongly suggest if you have an opportunity to try it. I think there's some places here in Toronto that serve it. But I was also very, very impressed at how efficient the market and the government runs. I recall our early days in open banking conversations. I was very impressed that the government was very open to hearing from the industry, to giving us that airtime. And I was also glad to see that the government here took a similar approach. The efficiency, but I think the other thing I noticed is, and I got a bit lucky in the sense that when I started there, this is about 2015, the fintech was really starting to gain hype, and there was a dedicated effort to build that space in Singapore. And we also saw that in Hong Kong afterwards with government projects, regulatory clarity, new legislation. So I was very impressed at how early the government there was at adopting and pushing legislation to support some of this work.
What are some of the differences between the financial services sector in some of the East Asian countries you've spent time in and Canada's?
What do you mean? From what perspective?
Just what stood out the most to you? Are the issues the same? Do the banks run largely in a similar fashion? Like, is banking across the world pretty homogenous?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, in the countries that I had the opportunity to work in, I think some of the points were relatively similar in the sense that financial institutions wanted to introduce new products. They really saw the benefits of quote unquote fintech, however you want to decide, however you want to determine that word. But another important takeaway was that this intent to partner with a lot of fintechs to be able to kind of roll out their products with partnerships, with the admission that perhaps certain organizations had developed a very, very specific niche that they could leverage. On the flip side as well, I think what was similar to Canada is fintechs coming to terms with the fact that, look, there's a lot of opportunities for you to work with incumbents, right? To grow your business, to reach greater distribution. So those similarities, I think you find in any jurisdiction. I think whenever as an organization, you choose a singular focus to really hone in on and deliver, you'll have opportunities to develop your product proposition to the point of becoming very attractive for larger organizations to partner with. So from that perspective, that's something I've seen here and I've seen in many jurisdictions.
So plenty of experience in the financial services sector, not just here, but around the world. You mentioned your legal background. You mentioned the French connection. You get the job as Canada's open banking lead. You spend all these months getting through it all. What was the most challenging part about this whole experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think going in, the biggest challenge I had was perhaps from a credibility perspective, from a couple of angles. First, for whatever reason, this had taken a long time to get to where we were, in the sense that, as you mentioned, the government was looking at it from 2018, there's rounds of consultation, and perhaps we had this certain degree of open banking fatigue, right? People were tired of perhaps hearing about it, but not really seeing progress on it. And for better or worse, it was the situation that I was being presented with. So I sensed that I had to gain credibility with my stakeholders. And I split that into two specific groups: credibility with those that were going to be part of my working groups, and credibility with the consumers. So starting with the stakeholders, I spent the first couple of months in my engagement really meeting with them, I've lost count of the number of meetings we had to share our vision as to how we're going to conduct these, the objectives, the scope of the information that we're going to share with them, the depth of it, and what we're trying to get out of it. And I think having a roadmap like that and really coining it as a, genuine working groups. I remember I would tell people, like, don't expect these meetings to be Sunday brunch type discussions, right? You're going to have to do a bit of homework. I will take it upon myself to make sure that I'm giving you very, very specific content. We'll analyze what's happening in other jurisdictions. We'll give you good materials. And I think laying out a roadmap early on with those stakeholders, explaining to them what's expected of them, what they should expect of me in terms of my obligations to them as well, and what we're trying to get out of it, I think helped me develop a bit of that credibility with the market to kind of show that, look, we're not recreating past work, right? We're not talking about whether or not open banking is good or bad. There's merits to. We've addressed those questions. We were getting really into the nitty gritty, and to be able to express that to stakeholders, to be able to outline a vision and a roadmap of how we were going to engage them, I felt got us going on the right foot, gaining a bit of that credibility, which subsequent working groups contributed to. Now, from a consumer perspective, I also felt like we need to, the work that we're doing, the Secretariat and I, we had to maintain credibility with the industry to make sure that there's transparency in our work, to dispel any misconceptions that there's backdoor conversations or agreements happening, right? And to that end, what the decision we came to is, in line with open in the open banking conversation, we should publicize all our work. So we created an open banking implementation website where all the materials that went to every one of those 4 working groups was public. The participants in those working groups were public. The questions that we asked them were public, but importantly, the outcomes of those discussions. And the outcomes were important to highlight because it's what fed the work that we did. In addition to that, we had the terms of reference for every working group, the terms of reference for the steering committee that we used to update everybody on. So we publicize this to gain credibility with consumers, to allow them to see the work that's happening, to see what points that we're trying to address, and perhaps in parallel start a conversation. If there's something we're missing, get in touch with us. The working groups were small. They weren't these giant 40, 50 group, 50 person meeting groups. We limited it about 15 participants each. But the website also gave an opportunity for those not in the working group to reach out to us to say, look, we're also thinking about this. We're not comfortable with this. So I think that transparency, that visibility, that openness helped us address that credibility issue, which personally I thought I had to overcome very early on.
Well, I feel like you did a good job, because I, to be frank, haven't heard anyone utter a critical word about you really throughout your tenure as Canada's open banking lead. I think the closest thing was maybe a large FI stakeholder suggesting that your recommendations to government were maybe a little too bold for their liking. But being called bold is no flaw for sure. So I think you did that really well. It definitely was open. It reminded me a lot of the Bank of Canada's process for the RPA, which is also held up as a bit of a standard. Both of which you guys did, I feel like, is a little atypical of other parts of government. So kudos to you for that. What did you think would be challenging, but actually turned out to be very easy?
Yeah, that's another good one. I think another myth was that going into this, what you were going to see is just a bunch of disagreements in these discussions, the typical bank versus bank, or bank versus fintech versus credit union disagreement. That
there are also bank versus bank disagreements.
Absolutely. I think another mistake people make is consider that every financial institution's thinking is the same. That's another thing that I noticed early on, because forcibly every bank has a different market it serves, a different product strategy. It's also competitive as well. So I think it's a misconception to think that they all think the same. So I think people had this misconception that these are going to be contentious discussions that weren't going to lead to anything. And honestly, I never saw that at all. And I think it spoke to the progress of the thinking around open banking from the initial days of doom and gloom. This is going to destroy the Canadian financial system. It's going to create security issues, which you've done a pretty good job dispelling, to looking at it from the perspective of, okay, this is coming. Our consumers are asking for it. We're seeing screen scraping on our systems. What can we do to leverage this opportunity to serve our consumers, but do it in a safe way? So I think what people would be surprised from is the degree of consensus we got out of these conversations. And don't take my word for it. Take a look at our implementation website. We've listed all those. So I think there was a lot of good agreement with respect to what the challenges were and how people wanted to address this, right? Which takes me to my point that, I think it's also a misconception to think financial institutions don't want open banking. Not at all. I think they're ready to compete. I think internally they've been developing the muscle memory to be able to enter the market, to actually leverage it from themselves. There's a degree of reciprocity that we built into the system where if you're collecting information, you also have the obligation to share it, provided it's within the scope of the system. So it gives a chance for them to compete as well. I think there was a lot of misconceptions, predominantly around lack of consensus, contentious conversations. Not at all. I was quite surprised to see that generally, I'd say most of the time, people were on the same page as to what the issues were and had real constructive feedback. The constructive feedback is even more impressive given that the majority of the working group discussions happened over the summer. So there was a lot of good engagement from that perspective.
One narrative that pops up every now and again is that big banks don't want open banking because it'll increase competition in the banking sector, and they don't want that. To be frank, I had that view a little under a decade ago when I waltzed into the financial services sector on the policy side. Since then, my view has evolved quite a bit in a way that I suspect many wouldn't be able to predict, just listening to me in public and all the things I say. To what extent do you think this narrative is true, or do you think there's something else that makes this difficult?
No, I completely disagree that banks don't want open banking. Far from it. Like I said, one of the fundamental elements of our system that perhaps you don't always see in other jurisdictions is this degree of reciprocity that goes in. If you're calling an API, you have the obligation to respond if somebody else calls that based on your consumer's request. And this speaks to the policy objectives behind our system. If you look at other jurisdictions like the UK and Australia, those open banking systems are being developed in the backdrop of bailouts, royal commissions, essentially financial institutions acting poorly, let's say. Our objective with Canadian open banking isn't to address certain market behavior. Quite the opposite. What we're trying to do is empower Canadians with their data to be able to make better decisions. So from that perspective, I think the policy objectives are different here. Policy objectives that we're trying to implement are not trying to address the behavior of certain financial institutions. Those financial institutions, based on those policy objectives, will have a degree of reciprocity in the system to be able to both leverage data that they share about their consumer at other organizations, as well as pass it on should their consumer request it. I think their concerns are the same as everybody else in terms of the lack of clarity with respect to certain fundamental issues like liability, right? Who's on the hook for something when it inevitably goes wrong? It's going to happen. And so we spend a lot of time outlining those security requirements. Financial institutions are custodians of your money, of your information. They want to make sure that when that information is being passed on, it's done so to a legitimate entity that has procedures in place, not to the same degree as theirs, but actual security, frameworks in place. So, and those concerns are ecosystem wide, because again, I go back to what I was saying earlier. This isn't a simple bank versus fintech, bank versus credit union, one-way street conversation. We're genuinely building a data ecosystem. So forcibly, we need to make sure that all the participants within it are maintaining the safety of that ecosystem.
So is it fair to, or rather, is it reasonable to hold the view that it's not competition or the idea of more competition that is slowing things down? The bigger and more important variable here is third-party risk. I'll just call it that. If we didn't have that, would this have been a lot easier to do without all the consultations, without the government involvement, without you and the role that you were in?
Well, first, I wouldn't qualify it as third-party risk. I think in banking, that has a certain connotation that I don't want to associate with open banking. So I'll park it there. But I think what you're trying to get to is, if we weren't looking at it from an ecosystem perspective, we have rolled this out faster. I don't know. It's difficult to tell. I had perhaps the benefit of disadvantage of being in my role for a short amount of time. So I already had a goalpost to get to. I knew the market was waiting for the output of our work and the decisions of the government, but I don't think the intent here was to rush it just to get it past the line, just to make sure that, we have an open banking system, let's go, we've done the work. I think what was more important, and it's certainly something that was dear to me, is to make sure we're getting some of these fundamental elements right. The objective wasn't to address every single issue that could come up, but really the infrastructure. And I think we've done that. And whether or not that's contributed to the delays or not, I don't know. I can't speak on that. But all I could say is that setting up this data ecosystem is not simple overnight type of work. Perhaps it's taken us longer than it should. But I think once we roll it out, once we have our framework introduced, we'll have something that from a global perspective, we could be proud of.
One question I struggle with, and that's what I'm trying to get at, what is it that makes this so challenging, is that in other sectors, we see companies expose APIs and share data a little more freely, and they don't need all this work to get that done. They just kind of go ahead and do it. What's the difference between those examples and this one that we're currently in Canada's banking sector?
Financial data, Alex. It's genuinely, whatever adjective you want to call it, it's plutonium, right? Data is the new plutonium. It's the uranium. It's oil. I don't know what they're calling it these days, but that's a major distinguishing factor here, in the sense that we're all very, very strict with the custodians of our money and our data, as we should be. And I think when you magnify that to the financial space, the requirements become more strict. It requires more attention because of the harm that it could create if it's done improperly, if that information is leaked, but as well as the benefits from an innovation perspective, from an economy perspective. I think it merits more attention, and it merits focusing on more elements that need to be addressed, as opposed to regular information that's shared in the context of just streaming services, for instance. You can't compare those type of services or other analogous ones to sharing your financial data. There's a degree of sensitivity there that merits greater attention.
Right now, 9 million Canadians, according to the department's latest estimates, already share their data. And I haven't read about issues. Maybe there have been issues and they're just kind of behind the scenes. Every now and again, you'd read about a data link, but it seems less about open banking and more just a breach or a compromise at a firm. Is it true that we do want our data to be that much more protected when 9 million Canadians are already doing it? And then 2, is it actually that important to safeguard it, given that it seems like a lot of the firms that access it do, to a large extent, keep it secure, unless there are all kinds of issues I'm just not hearing about?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. Look, I think this goes back to the conversation around screen scraping, whether or not this is something that we can live with, right? And going back to your previous question with regards to what surprised me, this is another point that I should have mentioned around this conversation, this need of screen scraping. And I don't think I came across any entity that wanted to maintain this, right? As compared to some other jurisdictions where even with the open banking system, you had certain stakeholders saying, look, we should still have a backup, or we should still allow screen scraping to exist. I think the interesting point of our ecosystem discussions is everybody saw the faults with screen scraping, predominantly the unreliability and the security issues that come with it. So I think it was an acknowledged truth among the stakeholders, among those participants, that, look, we need to move away from this. We don't have to wait for something to materialize, right, for us to address this. Going back to what I was saying, based on the sensitivity of financial data and the harm that could be caused if this stuff leaks out. So I never noticed any stakeholders pushing for us to maintain the status quo. I think there was an admission that, look, this is an unreliable and an unsafe manner of doing business. I can develop better products if I have a direct API connection. And I'd rather have a system that's built on this rather than what we have today.
I want to ask you a bit more about open banking, but I want to take just a bit of a break. Word on the street is that you have an admirable Jordan collection. For anyone listening who doesn't know what I'm talking about, I'm talking about the shoes, basketball shoes, Michael Jordan, the GOAT contender. When did you first get into Jordans?
Wow. That's a good question. I'm thinking about it. I'll say this. A large part of my youth was dominated by sports. And I had the opportunity to grow up around the Michael Jordan, the Dominique Wilkins, the Patrick Ewings, the Isaiah Thomas days, football as well. Football was my first love. And I was always blown away and intrigued at these athletes and, the performances they would put on. And I remember, I think the first time I came across Jordans and basketball was maybe around like the All-Star game, the slam dunk contest, and all the crazy dunks that, some of these basketball players at the time were doing. And I think that's the first time I came across Michael Jordan and the shoes he was wearing. And it blew me away. But surprisingly, my first pair of sneakers weren't Jordans. They were actually Reebok pumps. Again, inspired by another legendary dunk at the All-Star contest. But I think the funnier story is that Jordans and sneakers actually got me into fintech. Because growing up, every pair of sneaker had different iterations, different colors. And I would beg my parents to buy me multiple versions unsuccessfully. And I told myself, hey, one day I'm going to grow up. I'm going to have a great job. I'm going to buy all the sneakers in the world. I mean, this is me at a very, very young age. And so fast forward to many, many years after that, where I was putting a lot of hours in the early days of my career. And I recall this one day, somehow this came back to me. Like, wait, what happened to my passion with sneakers? Because it kind of died down, but then it came back with a vengeance. And I remember a promise I made to myself. And so I went on eBay and I found this pair of sneakers I liked and I bought it. And then and there, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. How the heck am I going to pay this person? And then I found out about PayPal, and then one thing led to another. I went down a rabbit hole, and here I am. So I love sneakers, but they're actually the reason I got into fintech, I got into banking, and maybe the reason I'm here today.
Air Jordans are behind Canada's open banking framework. Look at that.
Could be. That's your heading, right? That's the title for this.
How many do you have in your collection now?
Oof, I've lost count. I'll say this. I have multiple iterations of almost every pair of Jordan up to Air Jordan 13. And those are complemented by other sneakers as well. I don't limit my collection to Jordans only. I'm a sneakerhead through and through.
Okay, that's perfect for the game we're going to play in just a little bit. There's an artist named Brian Youngin. He's an Indigenous artist who's reported to have said that Indigenous art and Jordans have a lot in common. Some of the work he's known for involves essentially destroying pairs of Jordans, cutting them up in a variety of ways, and repurposing them into other things, such as Indigenous masks. He's reported to have said that his fascination with Jordans came about because he would often see them behind glass, as if they were in a museum. He'd seen Indigenous art in the exact same way, often behind glass, as if it were an object of nature to be protected in a museum, not a piece of art to be admired as such. So he took both and made art with them, to be recognized as art and not as some artifact you might dig up and put in a museum. Are Jordans under or overappreciated as objects of art in your network now?
In my network, underappreciated. It's not something I bring up when I meet somebody in our industry in banking and fintech. Hi, I'm Abraham, open banking. By the way, I'm fascinated by Jordans. It's not something I often come across. I think in the broader space, completely overrated. And I say that as someone who has a hard time buying the sneakers he wants now because of crazy competition from bots that buy up all the pairs and flip them on StockX and other websites. So I think from that perspective, it's very overrated. But I do agree that it is a genuine piece of art designed by artists. In fact, designer of the Air Jordans, Tinker Hatfield, he was an architect, right? That was his background, and there's a degree of art to that. So definitely their art.
So we're going to play the underrated, overrated game with individual pairs. We'll do this for maybe five or six. I'll walk you through a ranking of the best Jordans and ask you whether they're overrated or underrated. Best not by my definition, but just best by the internet. Air Jordan 1s. The first is always special, or is it? Overrated or underrated?
Overrated.
Why?
Jordan 1, overrated. The silhouette, although I love, never ranked at the real top of the game for me. I know there's the whole history with it being banned and the challenges Nike had with Jordan and how he wanted to leave Nike because of it. I just think the position that it occupies in the sneaker space is too high. A lot of people will disagree with me, though. I'll warn you on that.
Okay. Air Jordan 11s. Aesthetically, these are some of my favorite. The all black with some red and white accents. When I go to a conference or a parliamentary committee, this is what I want to wear. However, the people I pay for advice tell me, don't do that. Don't wear those. Jordan also came into that transcendental form we all know him for when he wore this shoe around that time. I read somewhere that this shoe caused a riot in a mall once. Air Jordan 11s. Overrated or underrated?
Underrated. My second favorite or perhaps third. I don't know. I haven't decided. Air Jordan of all time. I've got a couple of the colorways. I know you're describing the playoff version, the Breads. I've got the Space Jam version from the famous movie. One of my biggest pickups in my career. Completely underrated. I love those. I love the Jordan 11s.
Love it. The Air Jordan 3. This is, if I understand correctly, the first Jordan designed by Tinker Hatfield. GQ says it's what made J a J. It's, I think, the first in the collection to feature the Jumpman. Jordan 3s. Overrated or underrated?
Underrated. Greatest sneaker of all time. Hands down. Hands down. That's that is my favorite sneaker of all time. Just everything it did to the sneaker game, to basketball, that famous picture of Jordan with this. I don't know how many pictures you have, actually. I take that back, of him wearing the Jordan 3s and the different iterations of which. That is at the top of my collection. I love the Jordan 3, greatest sneaker of all time. Quote me.
Air Jordan 4s.
That's where I struggle, whether it's the 11 or the 4s that are my favorite. Especially the cement 4s. I love those. Whether they're overrated or underrated, I'd say they're just
appropriately
they're
rated.
Underrated.
Okay.
Underrated. Yeah, underrated.
Okay. This is maybe where we diverge a bit. So I was going to ask about the 5s, and I say we're going to diverge because I feel like these improved upon the 4s aesthetically for me. I still see a bit of the 4 in the 5, but not the elements that put me off, whatever those are. I also think, if I understand correctly, that Jordan got his career high for points in a game in the 5s. I think it was against the Cavs, 69 points. That shoe, overrated or underrated?
Underrated. I don't think I've seen as many retro releases of those. I love the fighter jet design that inspired the 5. The 4 was inspired, if I recall, from race cars. Michael Jordan was a big racing fan. But I would say that one's underrated. Yeah. It's not as good as the 4s, though.
Cheesy transition time. We all want open banking to be a slam dunk.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah.
Nicely done.
Ambreen, if you're listening, we need one of those drum rolls, perhaps. Or that's it. So we want it to be a slam dunk. People love to debate whether the government or the market better solves our collective action problems. The truth varies, I think, with the facts and circumstances. Governments are good at some things that markets are not, and markets are good at other things that governments are not. You've been doing a lot of press lately, and I think I read somewhere that you said the government had to play a role in open banking. Why?
From a couple of angles. The first thing is with respect to the Fed-Prov distribution of powers. I think when we talk about Canada being unique and a made-in-Canada approach, there's an admission that, unlike many other jurisdictions, authority over financial services is split between Ottawa and the provinces. That's our distribution of powers. So throughout my work, one of the biggest concerns I had is that since I was designing a federal framework, we ran the risk of excluding a lot of Canadians that have financial relationships with credit unions and not banks, right? So to be able to make sure that provincial regulators are on board with what's happening, that people that do business with credit unions are not left out of this system, you need a degree of government leadership. This is not for the industry to do. It's not for the industry to maintain the relationships between the federal and provincial levels of government. You need governments to do that. It's their job. They work with the provinces on a day-to-day basis, and this is just an additional element in their bucket of work. So from that perspective, I think it's very important to recognize that the government has to have involvement over open banking to make sure that every Canadian, regardless of the institution that you do business with, benefits from it. The other angle is that there's already some responsibilities when it comes to open banking that are addressed from existing regulators, right? Take a look at consumer protection. The FCAC already addresses that. That's their responsibility. So coordinating that with other government responsibilities, again, this is something that should rest with the government. And speaking of coordination, look, you've got legislation that's going through Parliament now that affects open banking, right? You have to make sure that there isn't anything that conflicts with whatever comes up, whatever framework is designed for open banking. I'm giving privacy as an example, right? That enshrines an individual's right to data mobility, whereas open banking is the system that describes how you do it. So you need a degree of coordination to make sure that there isn't anything duplicative or conflicting, right? Another government responsibility. But again, if you take another step back, and if you look at the other side of the coin, let's say you were to determine this to be a purely market-driven approach, no government involvement. Well, we've seen in many jurisdictions, the best example being the US recently, that unless you have government involvement, this system doesn't grow or doesn't grow as fast as it should. Consumers don't get the full benefits of open banking without government involvement. So I think it's very important, and I'm glad that this was confirmed in the fall economic statement, that oversight of the system should remain with the government.
So I kind of am liking more and more my cheesy transition. Open banking is going to be a bit like a slam dunk, because fintechs are going to need to jump high enough. They're going to have to jump high enough to get accredited to access the customer data. And if the government bans screen scraping, there won't be any other way. The only way will be to be able to dunk. As we know, not everyone can dunk. By design, there are going to be barriers to entry here. So why won't open banking, led by the government, actually reduce innovation by being too onerous for most fintechs and restricting their experimentation?
Yeah, that's another good one. And it's something that drove our consultations with the industry. We ran the risk of creating requirements that were way too onerous to prevent people from joining the system. By people, I mean organization, which is something we've seen in other jurisdictions. So that's one of the learnings we took away. But at the same time, not making it too easy for organizations who don't have the proper controls and security frameworks in place to be able to be proper custodians of the system. And I think it spoke to the quality of the work we did with the industry and the engagements that we held with the consultations to make sure that we reached a balance, right? You'll see in some of the discussions on many occasions, we questioned ourselves around what's proportional. How do we apply proportionality to this topic? And I think the way we design the framework addresses this in the sense that, let's take an accreditation, for example, we'll have rules that you'll have to fulfill from an operational security organizational perspective. But those rules are designed to, number one, make sure that new entrants to the system are all playing by the same rules, at the same time not being overly onerous to prevent them from joining and really being an issue at managing their business on a day-to-day basis. Now, that's not the prime concern. The concern isn't to help them run their business. It's to empower the consumers and make sure they're protecting their information. But we need to make sure that, the ecosystem will grow with network effects. That's how ecosystems grow, right? The more participants you have, the more beneficial it becomes. So it was a very difficult topic for us, and I think it's something that we addressed in the design of the framework based on a lot of the input we got from stakeholders.
We all stumble our way through lives trying to achieve that balance between conflicting things, and I think I've yet to find someone to strike that balance perfectly. We often err on one side or the other. Some of us systematically err on one side over the other. Given how governments work and what their mission is, do you think the government is erring on the side of being too onerous or too little? Or do you think they've perfectly struck the balance because you are the architect behind this?
Yeah, I'll speak with a bit of a bias, I guess. I think we achieved that right balance. And I think...
How can you be sure?
It's not... Well, I can't, unfortunately. That's what I say. Look, we shouldn't expect perfection with the system. It's genuinely foolish to think that, not only because it's something from a systemic perspective that is new here, like the practice isn't new, but having rules around it will be net new. But just the experience from other countries, it shows like you're going to have teething pains. So there's no way that I can be sure about this. I take comfort in knowing that we spent an extensive amount of time conducting the proper due diligence to make sure that, number one, we've identified the primary issues, right? And we've dedicated the right amount of effort to addressing those. And again, we're not going to cover everything. I think, what's the saying go? Perfection is the enemy of progress, something along those lines.
Sure, yeah.
I think we've addressed the major issues, and I think we've taken the right steps to making this a reality. There's no way of being sure unless we get this started.
What's the worst case scenario for open banking in Canada? Assume the legislation's in place, the requirements are what they are, but just the outcome is the worst case scenario. We're in that world. Describe it for me.
I approached my work from a infrastructure perspective in the sense that, for whatever reason, banking was the first use case for allowing consumers to share their data, right? I mean, this is what the conversation brought us to. But I never approached our work by simply designing a system that caters to this industry, right? This use case. I try to approach it from the perspective of, again, going back to the same term, this data ecosystem. How can we build this in Canada? So I think it would be a shame if we limited ourselves to banking, right? There's other opportunities, other industries that could benefit from data sharing. There's plenty of them out there. And so I think it would be a shame, number one, if from a financial services perspective, we just limited it to whatever scope we start with and not evolve it. But from a broader economy-wide perspective, from a consumer perspective and global competitiveness perspective, I think it would be disappointing if we just stayed with this iteration and not looked at other industries in which Canadians can benefit from data sharing.
In my work, I spend a lot of time talking about public policy, what the government can do better. But the rules of the game are just one part of the game, often the least exciting. More exciting is often the players. So, the Michaels, the Kobe's, the LeBrons, just sticking with the basketball references. So who are the GOATs of financial services in Canada? One thing I often hear is that it's the big banks. They're the GOATs. They've been around since before Canada was a country. They've been consistently profitable. They've maintained the market share they have. They are doing everything they ought to be doing, and there's little more that can be done on top of that. That's why fintech challengers are going to largely ride the bench until they retire. There won't be a fintech revolution in Canada, regardless of what the government does. Again, not saying that's my view, but just something I hear. Is that true or false?
Look, I think we've got a lot of great Canadian fintech champions. I think their product proposition and the people that work there are world-class, competitive with anybody else globally, at least from my experience working in other countries. I think we definitely have the right people. We definitely have the right organizations, and we've got some genuinely competitive and innovative products out there. So I wouldn't pick one or two to say this is the GOAT. I think we have the right environment. We've got the right group of fintechs there to be able to really serve Canadians' financial needs. But that's just today, right? With an open banking system, by outlining what data a consumer can share with other participants to empower that consumer to share, I think forcibly we're going to be developing more fintech champions, right? By making sure that there's rules of the game for sharing that information to empower them to serve their customers, whatever those needs are. I think net, it will be beneficial to our country and to consumers.
There's an argument I've heard that goes something like this. It's not actually outdated laws that's getting in the way of fintech innovation, or in the way of innovation in other sectors too. I hear that the bigger factor is a complacency, a complacent culture, which prevents us from making big bets. Here's an excerpt. I just want to read from a book by Doug Saunders called Maximum Canada, about how Canada was populated and unpopulated. Americans were the first major population group to settle permanently in Canada in more than token numbers, and they dominated Canada's population for 6 decades. From the 1770s until the 1830s, the majority of English-speaking Canadians were U.S.-born. Over the preceding decades, most ambitious and inventive immigrants to Canada had quickly departed for the United States. The colonies were left with a self-selected group who didn't want much from life, an agrarian, very religious, austere population of peasants and laborers who tended to see change and growth as a threat rather than an opportunity, and a consumer economy as generally sinful excess. What's worse for a country, a complacent culture or public policy that doesn't let new and emerging business models grow and scale and flourish?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm no historian or anthropologist, so it's a little difficult for me to answer. I'll say that over the past couple of years, I think from an innovation front and a progress perspective, I think we've taken the right steps in terms of growing our fintech and financial services participants landscape. I think we've done a pretty good job at that, despite other countries perhaps getting ahead of us, as some people say. But I've always liked to focus the conversation around policy objectives. What drove the policy objective in another country may not always be relevant here, and the outputs may not be applicable, right? We got to where we are because of our own journey, whatever the causes were. But I think we've taken the right steps over the last couple of years between consultations here, the RPAA, and just generally from a financial services perspective. I think we're on the right path to creating greater options for Canadians, growing the economy, and really being competitive on a global perspective.
Last question before I let you go. What's one thing no one asks you in these interviews that you wish people would?
That's a good one. I don't know. Yeah, nothing comes to mind. I guess it's created a lot of interest. So I've gone the majority of the questions that, I would expect to get. Nothing has caught me off guard to date. Although I like the Jordan questions, I'll tell you that.
So future interviewers of Abraham, make sure you ask him that. Abraham, thank you so much for appearing. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to having you back again another time.
It's my pleasure, Alex. Thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks for joining us. If you're looking for more, visit us at fintechscanada.ca or follow us on LinkedIn. See you next time.